Cool. Welcome, everyone. I know people are trickling in. Welcome. Thank you so much, AllVoices. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone attending. We're super excited to be having this conversation. I'm Natan Fisher. I want to explain a little bit more about AllVoices, Single Sprout, and then open it up to the panelists. So AllVoices is an employee feedback management platform that systematically asks for, accepts, analyzes, and acts on feedback of all kinds. You'll find good ideas, bad actors in real time, reducing turnover, reducing recruiting costs. When employees feel heard and belong, it won't be long before your company culture reflects your values. And then Single Sprout, we're co-hosting here. Single Sprout is a tech and legal focused recruiting firm. We're not like most recruiting firms. We leverage technology and data and really utilize accountability to help candidates and companies find the best fits quicker. We work with tech focused companies. We work with law firms, and we've hired thousands of people. And I'm really excited to have this conversation just to learn more about compensation, especially in this economic climate, especially going into 2023 when so much we don't know. But we have some experts here with me today. I'd love to hear from the panelists. Why don't we start with Ashley, then Enrique, Caitlin, and then Michaela.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Natan. Very excited to be a part of this conversation today. You say expert, I say expert in my own opinion. Experienced expert, but always learning nonetheless. So I am Vice President of Global Human Resources for a set of brands underneath Ziff Davis, Inc. It's a publicly traded media and technology business. And so my team and our work is focused on the people strategy, everything about the talent agenda globally, US, UK, Spain, India, France, Philippines, Singapore, Australia, and I have been doing this type of work for some time across different types of companies, small, medium, mostly, and I really enjoy this type of work, and I'm very excited and intrigued about this conversation today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Enrique, and I am one of the co-founders and co-CEO of Assemble. We're a compensation management platform, and our entire mission is to empower teams to make better compensation decisions, something I'm very passionate about, as well as my co-founder. She's a woman, I'm Hispanic. We both felt very passionate about pay equity, and it was something that when we saw firsthand how compensation is handled, we were very upset. Lots of spreadsheets, lots of errors, and really, really stark differences in how people are paid without a lot of reasonable reasons, I would say, behind those discrepancies or defensible reasons. And that really upset us. So we started Assemble to change that. Very excited to be here today.
Awesome. I'm Caitlin Knopp, CEO and co-founder of Pequity. Pequity is a company's compensation operating system, or their CompOS. And what we do is we allow teams to automate their pay philosophy and workflows, from band creations to offers to promos and comp cycles, all in the hopes of empowering our vision, which is fair pay and opportunity for all. My background was I studied HR, I got my master's in it. I went and ended up being a compensation consultant and a compensation manager for 10 years at companies such as Google, Instacart, and Cruise Automation. And I also found that despite being someone who ran these plans and who was empowered to help solve the issue, the true dilemma I was presented with was the gap between technology and the way that decisions were made, often in spreadsheets or emails and Slack, and not having a system that had a feedback loop or a way to consistently apply metrics or decision-making boundaries. So Pequity was born from that desperation to want to solve the pay gap, to help empower people to do better. And I'm very excited to talk about this. I did the count the other day. It was like 25 comp cycles in the past 10 years, and I still have all my hair. So I am really happy to pass along any of my learnings to make that worth it. And really appreciate you all putting this webinar together, because I think it takes a village, and I just love passing on this knowledge with other super passionate people.
Amazing. I'm Michaela Doan. I am the head of people and talent at GTM Hub. GTM Hub is a strategy execution platform through OKRs. We help businesses really bridge the gap between strategy and kind of that philosophy to executing and getting those outcomes. We are an international scale up and are currently going through the process of kind of revamping comp and how we do comp and how we think about comp. So this is very front of mind for me, and I hope to take away some tips and tricks from the panel as well. But hopefully, I can share some things that are interesting for all of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michaela. Thanks, everyone. Really excited to have this conversation and just learn as much as we can from each other, and obviously take questions. Please share, as you have them. So first question today is about compensation philosophy. What is your compensation philosophy or North Star? How do you develop your best practice around compensation? There's so many sources to benchmark in the industry, or individual expectations, changes in the market, expectations across the board. We'll start with Caitlin.
Yes, this is a question we get quite a bit. And I think it's really important to fundamentally align on what your comp philosophy is supposed to do. People, I think, go in and say, I need a comp philosophy. And we're like, okay, well, what are you trying to achieve? Are you worried about retention? Are you worried about how you're going to communicate the way people are going to progress in your organization and what their reward structure will look like? And really what you're building with this comp philosophy is your playbook of when we see someone is reaching the max of band, what does that mean? When someone's ready for a promotion, what does it mean so that we're consistent for every promotion? So I think you have to define like where and when do you want to use this? And small shout out, if you want a template, I have a template used in consulting. We give it to all of our equity teams for free. I'm happy to share it. But typically you're going to want to make sure it has the foundation of promotions, transfers, new hires, and what you do against competitors. Once you have that assessed, I think is when you can get creative. You can start to say, oh, I see that my competition always offers sign-ons for new grads. So I want to do something similar to offset that. And that's going to become part of my philosophy and my secret sauce that's competitive. But you can't really get to this creative place, which I think is what people want. They want to get to that, like all the glitz and glam and be able to offer the sparkly packages with, equity sign-ons, or we're going to give you like a 2-year refresh with a multiplier. And you can't get to that place until you've established true baselines of what can we achieve for people in a digestible way to help them understand what their employment and their merit system will mean at a company. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but would also love if any of the other panelists have ideas too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously we all want to get to the fun, creative part first, but understanding the philosophy, what's important in order to make those decisions. Michaela, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree with everything that Caitlin said. I like your definition of like what the purpose of a comp philosophy is and why it matters. And I think it's really important to share that with your team too. So when you're sharing this comp philosophy, like explain what is the purpose of having this, so that they understand. I definitely believe it's really, really important to align with your executive team on the comp philosophy and ensure that what you're saying, is in line with your culture and everyone agrees with that. So you don't want to have a comp philosophy that's at odds with your culture, obviously. An example for us is, I would say, something that we talk about kind of frequently is we believe in all cash and low frills. So we believe it's better to just provide people with better salary, better bonuses, obviously have the base benefits, but we're not into, giving everyone gym memberships and, food credits and all of these things. That's just part of our philosophy. It's part of our culture. And it's really different from a lot of other companies. So where a lot of other companies might say, that's very at odds with what we do. It's what we do and it's in line with our culture. I would also say ensure that your comp philosophy is aligned with what the business can actually deliver. So like operationally and within your budget, it's great to say, your comp philosophy is to pay people, at the top of market, but you need to make sure that that's actually like feasible within your budget. So I would say just like looking into those nuts and bolts. And before I think like executives can get a little excited and just be like, our comp philosophy, we totally believe in paying people the very best, top of the market. But then when you bring them the numbers, you're like, can we want to revise that statement? So I think those are some things that I would say. And yeah, finally, I think just a tip, like an actionable tip, maybe another one is don't be afraid to take inspiration from other companies. There's so much inspiration out there. I don't believe that you have to do everything. For the first time, you're not the first person who's written the comp philosophy. So I think for me, when I was developing it, it was helpful just to go and see, okay, what do other companies have as their comp philosophy? What are they talking about? Where can I take inspiration? Yeah, that's all I would add.
Where would you find that information from other companies?
That's a good question. So there are some like networks, CTO HQ is an example where like people will just freely share them and like Slack communities. I'm trying to think of the company that there's like one or two companies
Buffer?
that have them.
I would say
Yeah.
You're like the
Buffer
most
has theirs
famous.
published on their website. It takes a little digging, but some companies are really transparent about it.
Yeah,
I was
and
gonna
so I will add to that. So Buffer is definitely like the most famous pioneer for doing this, but like lots of companies have their wikis public. So like it'll be a little bit about their culture, a little bit about their hiring process or their leadership, etc. And in there somewhere could be some statements about their comp philosophy, the way that they approach performance, culture, and things like that. And so I think if you look on these sites like Built in Austin or Built in Boston or like these homegrown startup sites, but also all the Fortune 50, Fortune 500, Fortune 100, they're going to have on their careers page more information. So even if you're not looking for a job, you're not looking at those careers pages for actual jobs, that's where the nuggets of information about their actual practices are probably going to live.
Cool. And what was the Sorry, Caitlin.
I was going to say also GitLab. They had a calculator for a while. I don't think that is public anymore, but they do an awesome job at publishing it. And we also met a couple of startups like Athena. If I could put a plug out for them, they also published their pay philosophy. It's becoming more popular.
Awesome. Shout out to those that are giving that transparently. Someone also asked, Kristen, curious about cost of living adjustments, how that's being handled currently. Does anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So one of the things that has become very apparent over the last few years is that with the rise of remote work, location is a very important factor. And it's one that I definitely encourage every company to be very specific about in their compensation philosophy. So one of the things I always tell companies is understand how important is location as a factor for how you make decisions, and what are the resources you have available to you to decide how you're going to pay people based on location. So a lot of people say in a perfect world, I can get location-based data for every market that I operate in, and that is how I'm going to drive my decisions around how I pay people in different areas. And then they look for the data and it's either non-existent, really faulty, or small, or very expensive, and then they have to do something else. So there's kind of this spectrum of you can be location agnostic, which means location is not a factor, or location really matters, and you're going to get that local data. But what we see is that most companies end up somewhere in the middle. And what that means is that you can look at some data to inform the baseline, and then how you assign premiums or discounts to other regions, whether those regions are geographic or non-geographic. So the most common cases that we see in the United States, I would say, is companies assigning different tiered cities. So for example, tier 1 being San Francisco and New York, and for many companies, including Seattle and sometimes LA. And that is the most expensive kind of market where you operate. And then assigning premiums or discounts to any regions outside of that. So tier 2 cities might include cities like Chicago or cities like Austin or Boston. As for what discount you use, this is where I always tell customers market data should inform your decisions, but not dictate them. Because when you look at the data, not only is it misleading at times when there aren't enough data points, but it can also move in different directions. And if you're relying solely on the market, as you refresh your data once a year or every 6 months, or even more frequently, you might be jumping up and down. So the most common approach we've seen is your baseline being the most expensive market, that being tier 1, and then assigning somewhere between 5 and 10% as a discount below that for tier 2 cities, and then anywhere between 10 and 20% for tier 3. And again, a lot of this will come down to if a company wants to use location as a factor, and then how aggressive they want to be in certain markets. Because the kind of missing piece here is you may want to be strategic in a particular region that's really important to you and pay a premium in that region. For example, I'm based out of Miami. We might decide that for our company, we want to pay a premium in Miami. And that's how you can use a slightly lower cost of living or cost of market adjustment, kind of fluctuating what that percentage would be.
Thanks so much, Enrique. And I guess the ever important topic also, and how does that play in with inflation rising? Have you seen that make an impact? Did anyone want to jump in?
I was going to say, I think that this is a topic that's on everyone's mind, especially this time of year when people are doing their ranges, they're getting ready for comp cycles. And I think it's so important to remember that cost of living and cost of labor are two separate but correlated metrics. And cost of living it varies by location. The cost of milk in San Francisco is different than the cost of milk in Boston, and that can be really hard to track. And cost of living is highly driven by personal preferences. If someone is in a penthouse in San Francisco with 2 cars, their cost of living is going to be very different than someone who is in a 1-bedroom with a roommate and they bike to work. So when we look at how to build our ranges consistently and to be as fair as possible, the metric that most comp professionals will lean you into is cost of labor. And that is an important metric because it's driven by the supply and demand of workers and skill sets in the market. For example, we know that from the pandemic that we have a couple health tech companies with Pequity. Nurses' pay has skyrocketed. They're in high demand. There's a tightening of supply. And for those roles, it doesn't even match inflation. It surpasses it. So you will have to pay more to get nurses into your company. Now, for other roles where inflation is a factor, people will demand more pay to keep up with the cost of living. It's just part of it. You will not be able to get workers. They will move on to somewhere else. So you don't have to, I have a lot of companies who are like, inflation was 9% this year. Should I just add 9% to my ranges? The tactical answer is no, you don't have to do that. You can if you really want to, but I think, your finance team might come after you for that decision. What I would recommend is to look at your cost of labor from your market data. How does it compare role for role? What roles went up? What roles stayed the same? And for what regions did that change the most? That is going to be the most precise way to make sure that your dollars are going to the most strategic part of your orgs. Because if you do choose just to do a blanket approach to inflation, just apply a 4 or 8% increase, and you have, for instance, a nurse type role at your company, they're going to need a lot more of your budget, and you're not going to be able to hire as many. It's going to create attrition and retention issues later in the year, versus if you have a role that is actually doing great, there is no attrition or retention issues, you might not have to allocate as much budget to them. And so you want to be a bit more scientific about this, and don't, of course, employers are going to come to you and say hey, the cost of living is going up and I'm feeling it. We all are. But if you follow the cost of labor, it's the truest metric to make sure that you're being strategic and fair to everyone at your company.
Thanks, Caitlin. Ashley, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Caitlin was mentioning in terms of inflation, if you were to take a blanket approach to say we're going to match inflation every year, the sad thing is we'd have to take that same approach when things depressed, right? So think about, this is not where I am, but think about Detroit, think about places where the cost of living has gone way down. No one wants to sign up for a compensation decrease, but everyone wants to sign up for that compensation increase to match inflation. So we have to be careful when we're talking about inflation, that we don't try to take this blanket one size fits all approach, because it's not that way. And so the point that Caitlin was making in terms of the types of roles being strategic, as Enrique was mentioning, those are the things that we have to think about in terms of HR professionals, and the things that our teams have to make recommendations based on. So think about the comp philosophy, the location, what's required. Is co-location or this particular location required? What level of standard of living are we anticipating that this person will be able to have based on this? What does this market say that the skills demand within that particular market? And so many things come into those decisions, and no company, I would say, at this point has it 100% right. No company is stuck in their one way and not going to try to revisit this. We're all in a competitive, globalized marketplace at this point, especially in the knowledge or tech economy like we're in today. And so we're constantly evolving and taking this on. And that's why even in the beginning of my intro, we're not experts in anything, but very experienced at something and have an opinion. And we can provide lots of data, but we can provide data on all sorts of sides of those arguments and those perspectives. And so it's just really incumbent on us to be aware of what the market is telling us, what our employees are telling us, what can we withstand as far as business strategy, and how can we go forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. That's great. I want to add also, someone asked about compensation data. We do engineering every quarter. So if anyone has any asks, you can email myself or Katie. We'll plug that into the chat. I want to add also I really do agree on the cost of labor and what are we looking at from a skill set perspective. I mean, at least on the engineering and tech side, the majority of candidates right now still are very much interested in remote work, right? So they don't really, if they had their way, they might not say, I don't want you to know where I'm even living right now, but judge me based on my work, judge me based on what I can do. And so I think that's very interesting because it is clear, like there are some positions that it's just extremely hard to find someone no matter where they are. Ashley, I wanted to touch on something that you brought up, which was the state of the economy. Anything that anyone wants to share from latest in the market from a compensation standpoint? Have you seen layoffs play a role in compensation changing? Anything anyone wants to share? I think that's very timely.
Oh, you go first, Ashley. I was gonna say, you go first. You go first.
So I was typing an answer in the chat as well. I think as far as layoffs go, especially in the technology sector that I work in today, layoffs are a scary thing, right? People begin to think about their job, their livelihood as insecure, the economy, the marketplace as insecure. And so some managers can take a perspective to say, like, we're paying them. That should be great, right? We're not laying them off, and this should be appreciated, and we should all be grateful for having a paycheck because we're not being laid off and we're not being ousted of a company for whatever business strategy pivot, et cetera, that is happening. And it's on business leaders to make sure that we are being competitive in what we're offering. Still, even though people are getting laid off by the thousands in particular companies, and but we've got to be able to compete for that talent's commitment, their heart and their mind, right? So connecting their heart and their motivations to the work that they're doing for their mind to be able to be turned on so that they do the work that we do. And how we do some of that is through compensation. And while Michaela was mentioning the company that she works for right now is all pay, no frills, all cash, no frills, I work for a company that's very much about lifestyle benefits. And so it's very much, it's a different kind of mix of like, okay, so if we're all going to generally pay the same thing in these particular areas, we're all going to generally pay the same thing in these particular locales in which we hire people, what else can we offer to retain, attract our people? What else can we offer that we're going to get a good group 2,000 person discount on? What else can we do so that we have the ability to offer employees something that they're in particular asking for, like taking the mental load off of something in particular, one type of service business, a gas buddy filling up their gas tanks in the parking lot, etc. Like what can we do in order to add the sprinkle, because we're all going to pretty much pay the same kind of thing in the areas in which we may have our employees today. So I think when we think about layoffs, at least from my company today, we think about trying to still be competitive. Like, despite what's going on around us, what can we still do to maintain? Because while some companies are laying off, they're also hiring in other areas and competitive skill sets and so on. And so what can we do to make sure that we maintain the hearts, minds, eyeballs of our people today?
Thanks, Ashley. Any quick tips of areas to just share that would be a way to show and create retention? They're just following up on that.
Yeah, I think for us, we listen. I'll do a lot of listening. So I don't think it's one thing that any company can say like this applies to all companies. It's about listening and then giving that full loop. So for example, we listen, we hear, our employees really want to learn. They want to pursue these certifications. They want to grow to the next level designation. Okay, what can we purchase? Okay, we want to purchase an off-the-shelf learning solution. We want to offer an in-house training. We want to provide external coaching or a learning experience for an offsite weekend or an accelerated EMBA. What are we doing? And in order to offer that learning, and that's based on the inputs that came from employees. So it's not giving them cake and saying, eat it. It's making sure that they are having the inputs, and we're co-constructing that solution for their entire comp package. So base pay, bonus pay, but also these lifestyle benefits and abilities to grow.
Yeah. Go ahead, Caitlin. I'll go after you.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna also add that hopefully if you're making this tough decision to go through a layoff, you make it worth it and you cut deep enough that you can afford to also give increases to the people who remain, which sounds terrible, but it is a tough exercise. I've had to sit through several of them, and you want to retain every person you can, but you have to have this very realistic conversation of, well, if we kept Bob, and that's like great to do, what is his work going to be? And if he's going to be taking on 4 people's work, and if I cut him, I could pay other people a little bit more. And it is a terrible scenario to be in, but make sure that you make it worth it. I see a lot of companies who don't cut deep enough, and you see them go back again and again, and that is horrible for morale. You will have to pay people more after a layoff. It's just a fact. You need to be prepared for it. You're going to have to process more promotions because there are fewer people to do the tasks, and they're going to have to level up. So when we talk about retention, kind of echoing a lot of what Ashley was saying, you have to look at, what do I have to do from a fundamental pay place to make it worthwhile for people to stay here through this morale, like yuckiness, and to do additional work until we're back on our feet, because the exercise is to right size the company. It's not just because we're like tired of the workers. It's we need to build this very long-term vision for the place that we want to be successful one day, and we want these employees to participate in that vision. So tactical advice, if you're going through that process, it is painful, cut deep enough that you can make the promos and additional increases that you have to make.
Yeah, something else that I'd like to highlight and surface as an idea is going back to your compensation philosophy and understanding which compensation types are available to you. Like Ashley said, generally, I like to think about there's kind of 5 categories. So you'll have your salary or base pay, you'll have short-term incentive cash, whether it's commissions or bonuses. You'll have equity for some companies where it's more of a long-term incentive plan. And then you have allowances and perks. And this is where you can actually be very strategic as a company in understanding that perhaps we can't afford to do more raises, right? Maybe the budget just doesn't allow for that. But there are other things, like Ashley said, around allowances or perks. Or perhaps you do have equity where you can issue additional refreshers to incentivize that long-term retention of your employees, where if we can get through this tough period where we have laid off employees and where more is being asked of you as an employee, we will all come out, kind of participating on the upside on the other end. And we are seeing a lot of companies implement such policies now, especially when considering that, like Caitlin said, if you cut 15% of your company and you have further people leave, that's going to be even more impactful. And so how do you retain the existing 85%? And how do you motivate them? And compensation is a really important aspect of motivating your employees. So understanding the available resources and the constraints that you have as a business, we think is really, really important. Another one that we've seen is some companies implement year-end cash bonus programs when they didn't have that at all before. And so instead of implementing raises, it's we want to tie this to performance. Now, again, this all goes back to the philosophy. It may not be something that works for all companies, whether because philosophically you disagree with pay for performance policies and you don't have the administrative resources to objectively capture somebody's performance, but it is something that is available to you as an organization to motivate and compensate your employees.
I would add one thing, which is just, and maybe it's a little bit backwards for this panel, but I would view compensation. Of course, you can motivate people through compensation, but compensation, kind of like Ashley was saying, is table stakes, right? You need to be paying at least this much. You need to be on par with your competition. And if all your competition is offering these benefits, you need to have those too. It's kind of table stakes. So of course, you could just keep throwing money at your employees and more perks and more money and more perks and more money. But fundamentally, how much of that does it actually motivate people to go above and beyond? How much confidence does that instill in leadership? How much support does that give them from their managers? So I would encourage everybody to look beyond compensation, like rather than looking at compensation as the only factor of motivation when you're looking at retention. Like if you have a retention problem, of course, if your compensation is not right, correct it. You need to get that corrected, but then let's dig deeper and see, okay, do we have any other issues that are impacting people more fundamentally than, you know, the benefits that they're getting? Because sure, we could give them free lunch, but if we could, you know, invest in training their managers so that their management is better, is that going to go, you know, farther, I think.
This is all really helpful. I'm excited to also listen to the recording because there's so much good information. Just looking at the chat, there was a question, if we want to get to it, on how would you navigate an offered promotion and raise that is rejected because it's not competitive? Does anyone want to take that?
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Oh, it's good. I think I've seen it before, and I don't know how the others would feel on the call, but sometimes I like when someone tells me something's rejected because it's not competitive, I would probably send their HR BP in because I wonder if it's truly the comp. Like, is it the job content? Is this like a software engineer who is promoted to a manager and they never wanted to be a people leader and the IC work is just not interesting to them? It's the comp. Okay. I was gonna say, clarifying, as long as we've asked those questions, because sometimes I even have my own team who come to me, they're like, oh, like, you know, it's not that. I'm like, is it the comp, or are we just like not okay with something else? If it is the comp, I would probably ask them what they're basing this on. Is it they heard from someone else? Do they understand their comp plan? Did they hear that their buddy at Facebook got 100K sign on, which Facebook does? And like, now they're like, oh my gosh, I feel underpaid. Sometimes I think we get a lot of signals that are noise as individuals. And if you're not living and breathing comp every day, those noisy signals feel like North Stars. They're like, that's what I should get, when really it's an explanation of what our current program is and how we compete against that. Like coming to a smaller stage company like Pequity, like we're earlier, like our employees will get a lot more upside than if they went to a late stage, more established company, because they're getting options 3 years into the life of a company. And wouldn't they love to get stock at Facebook at 3 years of their lifespan? Like, yeah, like all of us would be like, can we please have some of that? So I think that there is some narrative creation a lot of times, but it is worth also looking at, is the comp competitive? Like if you find that it's the 25th percentile of pay, they might be onto something, and that's a whole other issue too. Ashley, I didn't know if you had anything else.
Yes, I would piggyback on that to say also not, this is not an uncommon thing that happens. And so doesn't happen every day, doesn't happen every month, but this is definitely something that occurs. And so to Caitlin's point, it's first about the digging as to the why. Now that the person has shared that it is the comp in the chat, the question becomes what about the comp and the work, like what type of data are they basing that request on? Are they counter offering with data? Are they saying that they're not willing to do the more responsible work or move into the new scope of role? So are they resigning, or are they keeping their current role, is also my question. And what are we doing about all of this? And if there are, oh, I see another regional pay, other offers, and scope of work in the chat. Okay, regional pay. So regionally, are we not competitive enough? Is this a macro level conversation and it's not about this one person and we need to kind of not band-aid this and dig a little deeper? Would be something that we should be talking about on the table. Other offers is in our comp philosophy and in our previous practice, because precedent matters. Have we been counter offering and doing competitive kind of retention increases in order to save someone, as we call it, in order to save someone? Are we doing that? Are we not doing that? Why are we doing that? What critical roles are we doing that for? What's the amount that we're doing it for? How can we look at to make sure that we're not being discriminatory in those practices? Let's make sure that those things are occurring. The scope of work. So do we have the wrong pay? Was it scoped wrong? Do we need to think about, is this a 2-person job? Is it something that we scoped incorrectly? And is this person and that manager able to explain to us why? Ultimately, there are many paths that this can take, like decision tree it out. But there's definitely some macro level implications here. And then you deal with the individual. The individual could be very disgruntled, right? If they feel like this is not this is not worth their time and they're considering other offers, and that might be a time that you have some what's the word I'm looking for irregrettable attrition, because they're going to leave. And so we've got to plan for the backfill, and we got to figure out what that looks like, because you're not going to go with us into the next season of our company because we're not ready for those macro level conversations yet, or we haven't made those calls. And that's okay. We got to be okay with that. It is painful for the short term, but we are growing as companies. As I said earlier, not all companies have gotten it right. I mean, not all companies. No companies have gotten it all right. And we're all evolving that way. But there are many factors inside why somebody wouldn't take a promotion, right? So they feel undervalued based on something else. They feel undermotivated. They feel underinspired, and then they also feel underpaid. Like there's multiple boxes that I feel like are not being checked here. And then because they're entertaining other offers, then it just becomes to me the old statistic that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, that if they're entertaining other offers and you're going to try to save them, you can only expect another 18 months from them, because in 18 months they're going to leave. And so what is the path forward anyway? Should we plan to shake hands and walk away at the 6-month mark, or should we commit to each other for the next 90 days, or should we say goodbye today? We'll need to make some of those calls through that decision tree. I hope that was helpful. And I know it's really ambiguous, but it's just like there is no one size fits all.
That's helpful. I think let's jump to another question. This has been super helpful so far on the pay transparency. So we're seeing some questions in the chat. I know that's very current. And so I want to start with Michaela, but how have state-by-state compensation transparency laws affected your strategy? Have you initiated or stopped location based on pay? And I know we have a question on like the range, which is something that we've seen and memes and all that.
Yeah. So this kind of going back to one of my initial comments, which is you want to make sure that your comp philosophy and your comp strategy aligns with your culture. One of our core values at GTM Hub is transparency. So we have always shared our ranges everywhere. Well, everywhere in the US, because as everyone has pointed out, global comp data is very challenging to find sometimes, but the US is not so hard. So this new ruling has not changed how we approach things too much, to be honest. We have a decent presence in Denver, and Colorado has had pay transparency laws on the books for some time now. My, I guess, ask of everyone, or my suggestion is just be transparent. I don't understand why we would try to only share data in 2 states and then hide it everywhere else. When I see companies before this New York law stating this role can be performed anywhere in the country and it's a remote role except for Colorado, to get around the Colorado pay transparency laws. I would say as our company, we've had no negative repercussions or results from sharing transparently our salary ranges. I would be really curious to hear from people, like if they are not comfortable with full transparency, why? Is it because of your own personal beliefs? Is it because of leadership? And what can we do to kind of convince our teams that that's the right move? But I think the stance here is like, it's really important to be transparent. Why would we waste everyone's time with not sharing a range for a job? Hopefully we have a range. Hopefully we know what we want to pay someone. Why would you want to waste your recruiter's time? Why would you want to waste the candidate's time going through even the initial stages of a process if the comp doesn't meet? Like, comp is table stakes. If the job doesn't pay what it needs to, then it's not a match. So I would say that's kind of my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Michaela. What would be a good reason today to, like, let's say, just looking in the chat from Remy about, some CEOs aren't interested in that. What would be a good reason to eventually or have that conversation with leadership to say why this is a good idea? I guess one thing that just comes to mind for me is if you're losing candidates, right, that's a good data point to say, okay, well, maybe there's a better way to use our time better. Right. And that's costing money. And maybe in some companies even have calculations of how much money this is costing. But I'll throw it back to you of any tips or tricks on why that's a good idea today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great call out. So if you could look at, for example, the total pool of candidates that you might expect for this role in this given market, and how many people are you seeing apply inbound? Like, what are your inbound application rates, and are they really low? If they're low, why? Could it potentially be because people are bypassing your role because they don't see a range and they're applying to other roles that have their range, which there are many of them. I know as a job seeker, that is personally what I would do. If you're looking at your recruiter efficiency, right? Are we spending a ton of time on phone screens and then people are dropping off at that stage because that's when we discuss comp and the comp isn't in line? Yeah, I think those are two kind of like metrics, two ways that you could look at it from a number standpoint to be speaking to a CEO or someone to try to convince them that this is a worthwhile initiative.
I think those are great points. Oh, sorry, Caitlin. I was saying, I think that those are great points. I think that's a very real thing. So we can look at a pay study, a benchmark booklet, or Radford tool or something all day. But the real data I found to come to a leader, CEO or not, to a leader to say, hey, here are these 10 candidate profiles, and you love all 10 of them. We talk to all 10 of them, and we're out of whack. Right. So like to come to them and be like, you want this, right? You want the shiny gold Cadillac? Here's what this like requires of you. And so then we can have some greater level conversation, but bringing them the data, something that's quantifiable, something that they would like, right? So we're trying to solve your problem. Your problem is not that there aren't candidates out here. Your problem is that our comp is out of whack and we need to revisit it. And then we can go get some other data. We can look at the pay studies. We can look at the benchmarking data. We can look at all that we need, but we need to be able to prove that. You can't go on a gut. This is not on feeling. There's actual data out here that we can point to. And it's easier when you make that personal connection. Somebody said that you have a Honda Accord budget looking for a Ferrari in the chat. I love that. And that I think is like something to pull the heartstrings or like motivate someone to think about things a little differently. They may not make a decision based on N of 10, a sample size of 10, but that helps to kind of frame up that conversation.
I also wanted to add some tactical. So one of our internal values and that we also apply to our product is meet people where they're at. And we do, I want everyone to post there. I'm like, just get the equal information out there, but we recognize not everyone's ready for it. So what we've been seeing, we have a free tool that we let people post their ranges on. We've been monitoring it, just seeing what people end up doing. And an interesting part to keep in mind about these laws is it just states you have to post, like in New York, it's a min and max of what you would reasonably expect to pay the person at the time of posting them. It doesn't say that you have to go get market data and say that this is my like exact part, this is what I'm going to do. You can do that. Like a lot of companies should have pay bands because I think that's how you get to consistent budgeting, but it's kind of a loose interpretation. And a creative way that I've seen and that I encourage people to think about and that we've actually implemented at Pequity is to use your own employee data. What I mean by that is we've seen companies who said, I have my range, and you run into the dilemma of I'm posting a role. I don't know if it's an L3 or an L4. I don't know if it's going to be this location. How do I do it? We show all of our locations geos. We usually show 2 levels because we anticipate we'll get candidates across 2 levels, especially at the junior end. Senior end, we're very pinpointed into. And then we like to show, if it's 2 levels, the midpoint minus 10% of the lower level, and then up to the median pay of employees plus 10%. The reason that we're using our employee medians to help with that is because realistically, especially as a compensation software company, I'm not going to hire someone 20% above the peers in that role. That would be an exception. So if you wanted to use your employee pay to help drive things, that is considered a reasonable expected rate. You have proof that is what you would pay because your employees are actually paid within that realm. And it's also a really good way to align it to employee expectations. We hear a lot of concern from people about, well, how will my employees interpret it if they're not at the range maximum, or if they're at the range minimum, or if there's this or that thing happening? Your range is based on a signal from market data, which contains, by the way, hundreds, if not thousands of people you would never hire. You're using that because you need a direction, but you shouldn't anchor on it so strongly. The strongest anchor you should use is what it actually took to close the people who passed your hiring bar that you were interested in, that are at your company today and that are staying with you. And not that you don't revisit and give them increases, but that is an okay metric to use to build these ranges. And it'll eliminate some of those issues of posting a really broad range where your employees aren't at the maximum, because you're going to show pay that's relatively similar to their own. So I like to provide that as like a tactical, different way to think about it. We've helped a couple other companies implement similar practices, and it's been fairly successful and well received. They communicate to their employees. We're fairly transparent with our employees about it. It just makes it a bit more realistic to people versus saying, here's this range that I just, took and did an analysis on. It was very thorough on, but still just from a market survey set that may or may not apply to me. It's like, this is actually what we're paying people and how we would bring in a candidate today.
I think a couple of risks to highlight with that strategy, because we've seen some customers attempt something like that too, is you have gaps where you may not have employees in a particular job you're going to hire, and this approach may fall short in those cases. And for some organizations where they currently have pay equity issues, this can actually exacerbate some of those decisions where perhaps there's a segment of your population that's underpaid. And if you're basing new decisions based on underpaid employees, you're actually exacerbating an already existing challenge. So what I've actually instructed our customers, or I've given them the advice around, is actually honor your compensation bands as best as possible and use your compensation bands both internally and externally. As for how transparent people are with those bands, we are kind of seeing three different archetypes. One is we are going to be literally exactly transparent internally and externally. These are the bands that we live and breathe by, and here they are. And Remy, to your question earlier around, is 150 to 200 reasonable or not? In some cases it is. I think that one missed opportunity for people is that you think of a band in isolation, but you have to take it in context with how many levels there are in that career ladder, for example. And if there's only 3, that actually might be fine because you expect employees to be within that band for a much longer time than some other companies. So kind of one archetype is fully transparent. The other one is they actually shorten the range, and instead of showing the entire range, they might say our range is from 150 to 200 internally, but we're not going to bring in anybody above 175 because we want those new employees to actually have the ability for us to give them raises and not just a promotion. And so they're actually saying this is our hiring maximum effectively. And then the third archetype that we're seeing is actually broadening the bands, because what they're saying is we might hire at L3 or L4, and we'll join both bands together so that we have a broad range. And where your compensation will be determined, it'll be whether you're an L4 or an L3, but the job posting itself is actually combining both of those bands into one. So I'm not exerting my opinion as to which of those 3 archetypes I think is best, because context really matters. But I do encourage people to actually honor their compensation philosophy and their compensation bands and actually leverage those to make decisions, because otherwise you may end up missing some data points or actually exacerbating decisions you've made in the past, which may be counterproductive to what you're hoping to accomplish.
And I think it's a fair call out. And the one thing I will warn to counter is having ranges and sticking to a philosophy is important, but really your midpoint and what you're paying people matters the most. Because I'm sure, as anyone who's run a pay equity test can affirm, you can hide a lot of discrepancy in a really wide range. Posting something that's too wide from 100 to 200K is very easy to put a lot of women and minorities at the minimum, and then you end up with other demographics at the upper end. It's what a lot of people end up experiencing. So it is definitely stick to your pay ranges, but the more realistic you can get to your people is actually what you're practicing. It's, practice what you preach. And to me, I mean, if it did come out that there was a pay gap and there was a pay disparity at Pequity, and it came out because I showed these ranges, I'd be so happy to see that, because it's the right thing to do to correct it. I don't want to mask it with too wide of ranges. But I do agree that a lot of people have, the philosophy of combining the min and the maxes. And we saw the 0 to 2 million system error that got posted on the day 1 of the New York law post. Don't do something that crazy, but keep in mind that the broader you do bring it, it will drive a lot more negotiations, especially from people who are already predisposed to negotiate more. And it might drive more pay disparity at the end of the day too, if it's too broad.
Totally agree. We have a little less than 10 minutes left. I know there's some questions still in the chat, Remy, coming in on more of the archetypes. Anyone want to touch on that? Or if anyone has anything else that they want to share?
Yeah, I was just typing back to Remy, so I will just verbally state it. So Remy's question, because it's not public, all of those archetypes are centered around very precise job architecture and a non-flat org. I know that all startups have all of that mapped out, and most don't use concrete leveling until they're much bigger, right? And so that being said, absolutely. So career architecture, job families, job leveling tends to be things that companies invest in once they've gotten to a little bit of size, they have some runway, because it's something that most founders aren't necessarily concerned with on the early stages of their business, simply because it's not required to keep the lights on, right? So you've got like foundational, fundamental level existence of a company's HR, people function, etc. Some managers may take take it on themselves, like take the initiative to create some competency level and job architecture, and that's great for their particular function. In terms of how they think about just some scope of role, responsibility, accountability level, strategic input, criticality, the things that they're thinking about in terms of that person's knowledge, skills, and abilities, their KSAs. That's something that a HR professional would help them to work through at the org level, not the functional level. And then HR business partners can partner with them at the functional level. But all of that informs kind of pay structure and pay bands and all that stuff. So that's not something that most small companies are doing. They're not going to invest in it at the moment. And it's not wrong for them to not do that. They need to get their own stuff set up, entities and hiring and onboarding and all the above. And so those things are just for typically when somebody's like later in their company life cycle. Also, when they're able to invest the time and the bandwidth and the people skills to doing those things, because they do take kind of that customization of understanding the business strategy, how we're gonna structure the roles, the bands, and then how we're gonna facilitate that mobility, like the different phases of thinking about people's growth inside of a business. Not something that typically smaller, flatter organizations take on. It's aspirational at best when they're thinking about that. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Ashley. Anyone else have anything that they want to share? We're just wrapping up. We probably have time for one more question or a few more comments.
Yeah, I posted this on the chat, but I definitely would agree with Michaela and encourage companies to, even at the earliest stages, develop even a basic framework for how they're going to approach compensation. And I love a Yogi Berra quote, which is that if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And not actually having a compensation philosophy and a basic set of levels and bands can lead you into very difficult places. And you may end up overcompensating or undercompensating somebody. It introduces the risk of pay equity or attrition down the line. And so even just having a basic framework will be really helpful to guide decisions. And over time, you can develop greater competencies for those levels, right? You can develop greater scrutiny or greater specificity for those levels and those bands, but even a basic framework can be really enlightening for companies. I know that we started ours before we even hired our first employee, and it was really helpful to have a comp philosophy and levels and bands. And over time, they've become more complex and more specific as we've added roles. But even just the basic framework has guided how we make decisions. So definitely encourage companies to do that even day one.
I'll just add quickly, Remy, I mentioned we're in the process of building this all out. So I am in the position where I'm like, oh, I wish this was done earlier. We couldn't tackle it. And now we're 300 something people, many departments, many orgs, and having to structure it out when you're that late is challenging. So I would definitely recommend getting it done like earlier. Of course, when you're only 20 people, you don't even have, levels at all. That doesn't make any sense. But once you're reaching, 70, 80, 100 people, you have a couple departments, you have a few levels, 1 or 2 levels. I think it's a really good thing to invest in. I will say, like, for what we're doing with the absence of levels, it's maybe a Frankenstein approach to what Caitlin was mentioning, which is, okay, get the market data and then look at what we're paying people now and figure out a range that makes sense based on that. So it's very, it's not as prescriptive, right? We don't have a very prescriptive system. We're just going off of market data that we can find, and then what are we actually paying people, and making sure that it's fair and that it's competitive in market, and that is not done in the system. It's just done manually. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what we do.
And I'll toss on just some small, hopefully tactical advice to it too. A lot of small companies, I think, try to dive it. Like we see most publicly, like the big company structures, which are, I think Microsoft has like 100 levels, and we're like, oh, do I have to do that? You really don't have to. When we started with Pequity just coming out the gates, like we had nothing, and we implemented early because that's what I do. Like obviously, I was like have to have a structure, and we decided to stick to, I think it was 3 and 3, where we had like entry, senior, principal for our IC levels that had pay associates. And then we had lead, manager, and head. And we bucketed that way because it made the most sense for what we needed. Like we didn't have enough layers to create a huge world of organization. And what you're really going to do is slowly tack on these additional levels as you need more middle layers of management. Like if you don't have if everyone's reporting to the CEO, you don't really need many levels other than to dictate pay. I will also add that you'll probably find this happening when you either go for like a compliance certification. SOC 2, for instance, requires that you have a leveling system. Some people don't realize that. It's so that you don't hire a new grad and slap on the title director of security and like put them in charge of your security process. So it will happen sooner than you think, to Michaela's point, and it's so painful if you wait too long, because there'll be little kingdoms that form. Like leaders will come in and they'll build their own level structure independent of each other, and their employees start to grow and adapt to it. And then trying to get people onto one cohesive one, it's really challenging. So listen to your HR peeps, get levels in early and build competencies to those levels. Like how much experience does it require? What is the scope of their work? Do they lead people or not? How much technical ability, how much autonomy does that person have? Because the number of people who'll ask for you for a promo, it doesn't go down. It just goes up. So you need to have an answer to those people too.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, Enrique. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Michaela. I think this was super helpful. I learned a ton myself. I mean, one takeaway of creating that framework, no matter how early you are, makes a lot of sense. And I know it's not always easy because we don't have someone directly in that position, but the earlier you can get ahead of your quote unquote problems, the better and easier they're going to be. Doesn't mean that they're going to go away, but either way, thank you so much to AllVoices. Thank you to all the panelists. And most of all, thanks so much for everyone that attended. We really appreciate all of you. We'll be having a recording come out in the future, I know, from AllVoices. And if you have any questions about anything tech related, I'm at natan@singlesprout.com. Maybe we can each just put our emails in the chat just so everyone can see. And then we'll sign off.